Well, global stock markets have risen as Joe Biden won those key states of Wisconsin and Michigan. Investors had been betting on a blue wave of Democratic victories from the election, but are now adjusting to the more complex results. To talk a bit more about this with us, let's bring in our business editor, Stephen Carroll. Stephen, talk us through what's happening on the markets and why we're seeing these rises.
So this rise on the global stock market started around really 24 hours ago in European trading. It carried through what was happening on Wall Street yesterday, through Asia earlier on. And now if we look at what's happening on the European markets today, we're again seeing fairly significant gains on main European markets. London, Paris and Frankfurt all trading up. Paris and Frankfurt up over 1% a short time ago. So the gains in stocks is still happening, and even US markets expected to see further gains when they open for trading later. Wall Street on track to have its best election week in decades, in fact, if those gains transpire when Wall Street begins trading. And this is essentially as investors are coming around to what their vision is of how they see this election turning out. So they'd expected a blue wave, that didn't materialize. So the current scenario that investors seem to be betting on is that Joe Biden will win the presidency. The Democrats will retain control of the House, but not the Senate, where Republicans will be in charge. And essentially that's creating what is being referred to by market analysts as gridlock in Washington, where not so much major policy changes will be able to be passed by Joe Biden as president if he's confirmed in that role. So essentially what that means for investors and for the business world is that while Joe Biden has made big promises on issues like stimulus, and that's something the markets like, he might not get as much agreed to by the Republican-controlled Senate through in stimulus and in taxes, where Joe Biden wants to raise taxes. For example, the top corporate tax rate, he wants to go up from 21 to 28%. Well, he might have difficulty in getting that passed through a Republican Senate as well. So the idea is investors are trying to gameplay what they see as the eventual outcome and what sort of impact that might have on those key policies that affect business. For the moment, they're seeing that positively, and that's why we're seeing gains.
Stephen, some industries could face big policy shifts if Joe Biden is successful. What sort of changes are we talking about?
Well, if we start with the technology industry, and technology shares is one of those sectors that actually have seen fairly significant gains over the past 2 days, as I say, that the investors are coming up with their scenario of how they see the final results turning out in this election. So there is a push within the Democratic Party to impose more regulation on technology companies. But again, if they don't eventually have control of the Senate, that's going to be more difficult to do. So investors are guessing that perhaps there won't be any massive crackdown in regulation targeting the technology sector. And while those companies may face higher taxes, perhaps they won't face as high taxes as would be the case if the Democrats had swept the presidency, the Senate and the House. If we look at the auto industry, they would be expecting to face stricter emissions regulations under a President Joe Biden, but they would, on the other hand, get more support for producing electric cars. Biden is talking as president of introducing a tax credit for electric vehicles, but also investing in electric charging infrastructure. That could be good news for the auto industry to give them more work and more business in the future. And then the pharmaceutical industry, another one that could be facing policy shifts. Joe Biden has said that if he's elected president, he wants to drive down the cost of drugs, particularly those bought by the government insurance programs like Medicare. That could be bad news for the pharmaceutical industry. But on the other hand, if Joe Biden was able to implement his public health insurance option, that would mean more people potentially being able to buy those drugs. So those things might balance out. Lots of people in these sectors are watching closely to see what the final outcome is. They're operating off this one scenario. But of course, if there's an upset compared to what they're expecting, we could see a lot of volatility on the markets coming as well.
Stephen, thanks so much for that. They are not the only ones watching this U.S. presidential election very closely. Stephen Carroll there, our business editor. Well, of course, our coverage